Story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest, wonderful story of love, for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee.
All right, so we are in the third section of this gospel, or actually, I guess the first section as I've broken it down, but the third part of section 1. It began with his ministry in Galilee. It got to a climax point in his ministry, and now he is expanding beyond Galilee. And we're going to be introduced here to a woman, and we'll just go ahead and read verse 24. From there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and we're going to look at that in just a moment. I think on the map, I think it's identified. He entered the house, did not want anyone to know yet. He could not be hidden, but immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. And the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And so we want to identify, and they are not actually identified on this map. I looked at several maps this morning and picked the one that I thought would be best, but Tyre and Sidon are not identified on this map. But he was in this region. Oops, that's not what I was trying to do. He was in this region right here that he has moved to. Tyre and Sidon are along this coastline. I roughly stick them in there, I think, where they go, those little black dots. And what Syrophoenician, the word actually is a derivative of Syria and Phoenicia. Phoenicia was a nation that had kind of been taken in by Syria at this point. And so the people from that region were simply known as Syrophoenicians, and that's what it means. So he has moved from around the Sea of Galilee, where he's done most of his teaching, and he's moved all the way out to this region. And he interacts with a Gentile woman here. And that is the setup for this short thing that Mark introduces us to. So he goes to Tyre and Sidon, or in the area of Tyre and Sidon. He goes into a house. He doesn't really want people to know he's there, but at this point, it's pretty much impossible for him to stay hidden. Think of this the way that you think of any person of renown at a time. Okay, he had gotten popular at this point. People had heard of him. They had heard of the things that he had done. People were talking about him. There was a buzz about him. Anytime he went into an area, people heard rumors and suggestions as to where he was at. Usually those suggestions somehow or another turn out to be correct. It happens. We see it more often than not anywhere in our culture when famous people get hospitalized for some reason. And there'll be large masses of people that collect outside the hospital because they've heard that they're in there. In my youth, it was Elvis. And the telltale sign of Elvis being in a particular hospital was aluminum foil being placed on the windows in the room where he was. So people, they just collected outside there when they had heard that's where he was at. That's kind of what's going on here with Jesus at this point. He doesn't want people to know, but he couldn't be hidden. People saw him, people recognized him, people talked about him, people told their neighbors, and the buzz. So there begins to be a collection of people. And among them is this woman who's got a daughter who had an unclean spirit, it says. And she came and fell down at his feet. And the woman was a Gentile. That's obvious. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, who was Jesus teaching and addressing in his ministry? The Jews. And that is primarily his focus. And he says, let the children be fed first. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, that kind of upsets sensibilities from some people today. It wouldn't have necessarily upset sensibilities in my early childhood. That was the kind of thing that we might have actually said of people, but we kind of get sensitive about that today. But in essence, what he's saying is, look, I'm here for the Jews, not for the Gentiles. So it's not proper to take what's meant for the children and give it to the dogs. So I'm focused on the Jews. And that's all he's really saying to her. And she answers him, yes, Lord. So she doesn't take offense. And she doesn't behave, I think, the way that a lot of people today might behave. Instead, she acknowledges that she understands that. And she understands that that's proper. But then she says, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Which is tantamount to her saying what? Obviously, this is all figurative language. This is the way that human beings communicate day in and day out. What does she mean by, well, yeah, I understand that, but even the dog gets to eat the crumbs that fall off the children's plates. What does she mean by that? Anybody have any ideas? Okay. And if there are crumbs that fall off the plate, that means that what? The children had them offered them, but what did they do? They didn't pay enough attention. They weren't careful enough to take them. And in fact, we generally think of the crumbs that fall on the ground as being what? Yeah, unimportant. And if we have a dog in the house, what do we usually do? Peggy's not in here, but clean up on aisle 3. We actually call the dog to come get it off the floor. That helps us out. And I don't have to clean it up. Let the dog clean it up. And so that's essentially what she's saying. Well, I understand that, but it's even okay for the dog to get the leftovers, what's not wanted. And so listen to his response. For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. What does he mean by for this statement? What does he view this as an expression of? Faith. And we're not talking about faith in the common, popular, vernacular type of faith. We're talking about real faith, the kind that trusts him, that trusts in his judgment, that trusts in what he's, yes, Lord, I understand that that's the way it is. I understand that that's the way it should be. But would it be? Now, this isn't completely unique to Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry was to the Jews. And even after his death and resurrection and ascension, when the gospel was first preached, who was it preached to? The Jews, and the Jews only. If you read through the early part of the book of Acts, it's all the way until chapter 10 before God says specifically, take this to this Gentile. And that's with the house of Cornelius, right? And then it's even later than that a little bit before Paul actually turns and goes to the Gentiles openly with the gospel. When Jesus talked to his disciples about it, he said that it would be preached first in Jerusalem, and then in Judea, and then in Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. And that was the plan as to how the gospel would be disseminated. But while Jesus was here, we have these examples of Romans who come to him with daughters that are sick or servants that are sick, and he is not withholding his help from those people simply because they're not Jews. And in fact, in one of those cases, the Roman centurion comes and says, hey, I need your help. And he says, okay, I'll go to your house. And he says, oh no, I fully understand that it would be improper for you to come in my house, that would make you unclean. And I also understand authority, because I have people who have authority over me and they tell me what to do and I have to do it. And I have people that I have charge over and they have to listen to me. I understand authority, and I know that all you have to do is say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus, from quite a distance in another city, says, your servant is healed. He travels home, and when he gets there the next day, his servants report back that the servant was healed the very hour that Jesus had said that to him the day before. And so he responds to people who are responding to him and who believe him and recognize his position and his authority and place their confidence in him. Even the very first miracle that Jesus worked was not part of the, initial intent. Because when his mother came to him with the problem, you'll remember it in John chapter 2, he said to her, my hour is not yet come. And her response to that, to the people that she was seeking help for, was just do whatever he tells you to do. And again, I would suggest that it's because of the faith that even his mother placed in him, he granted the request. So while he was ministering primarily to the Jews, the work and the benefit of the work was always intended to be to all men. And that goes way back. You go back all the way to the promise that was made to Abraham back in Genesis, and it was through your seed, all nations will be blessed. Now, the primary work was to the Jews, but he's showing us and demonstrating it with his authority to heal. He's showing us that the Gentiles can receive blessing as well. Did his, even the 12, did they completely grasp the point of this? No. And in fact, when Peter was sent to Cornelius, God had to repeatedly tell him it's okay. Don't call something unclean that I've told you is clean. You go and talk to these people and do what I've asked you to do. And he had to be convinced. And then even after being convinced and going back the next day, back to Jerusalem and explaining to the brethren there that this clearly was the work of God, that God approved of them and that God accepted them and that we need to accept them as well. A little while later, when he found himself among uncircumcised people, he pulled himself off and remained aloof because he was concerned with what the Jews would think. And so even after he learned the lesson, he still struggled with the concepts that the Gentiles were always intended to be part of the received people. But Jesus is showing us very early on that his blessings and his power are for the benefit of the Gentiles as well. Anybody have any questions or comments about that?
Obviously, gifts can be given by God.
Yep. So he moves on, returning to the region of Tyre. He went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis, which is a little area of 10 cities that were of note. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers in his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Epaphata, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He's done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, there's obvious, I think, signs or reasons for these signs. Why did he give the blind sight? Why did Jesus heal the blind when he healed blind people? Not just to make people see, but to teach us that he was here to do what? To open our eyes, to enlighten us with the gospel. Why did he heal lepers? To show that he was here to cleanse us from our sins. While seeing, they see not. While hearing, they hear not. Why did he open the ears of the deaf? So that we would understand that he brought us to make us hear. And he does all this to empower us to do what? To speak. To speak those things that we have seen and heard. That's what he tells his disciples to do, right? To go and speak those things that you have both seen and heard. And so we're supposed to be opening our eyes and opening our ears and then speaking. Now, a couple other things that are just of interesting note about this. How good are we at restoring hearing even today with all the medical advances that we've made and the tools that we have and the technology? How good are we at actually making deaf people be able to hear? Not really very good. What about people who have these kinds of speech impediments that are developed because they haven't been able to hear clearly? You can't do much with that. It's not like that impediment just vanishes. They can work and work and work and get rid of some of it, maybe even a lot of it, but probably to the day that they die, they're still going to have a style of speech and a type of speech that gives way to the fact that they were not able to develop speech the way that a hearing person can. And you see that from time to time with actors or something that are on television who have hearing problems. There's a particular way in which they speak. You hear it, you know exactly immediately they've got a hearing problem. What he did to this man was restore his hearing and restore his speech immediately. This wasn't learning and training and development and a lot. This was an immediate transaction, demonstrating his power and authority. His power and authority to open men's ears. His power and authority to give men what to say. You'll even recall that. He told his apostles at one point, they weren't yet called apostles, but he said, not to worry about what you're saying. It will be given to you what to say. Guess what? It's given to us what to say too. We've been given the message. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation. What are we to preach? The gospel. The word that was delivered to us. We don't get to pick and choose what to teach. We don't get to decide what's important and what's not. We're told what to say. And the authority behind that, when he says things like it's recorded in John chapter 12, the word that I spoke is what will judge you in the last day. The authority behind that is what worked this miracle. And again, the reason for all the miracles was to provide testimony, divine testimony, that God was working. That's a good question. I don't know. I want to focus more on the backside of that, but I appreciate you bringing that up. He asked for the benefit of the guys online and other people but why do you think that he told him, don't tell anyone? I don't know why. Other than, I'll tell you this, the beginning of this story is he clearly has left the region of Galilee where he's been working and gone to the opposite coast, and he goes into a house, it says expressly, because he doesn't want people to know he's there. And so he may be doing some crowd control. And the more people talk about stuff like this, what happens with the number of people that come to him or pressing upon him? If he's trying to take some time, well, he doesn't want to. He's also not trying to build up his personal reputation on the earth. He's trying to minister and teach. I'll give you another example. We have that one incident where he's teaching and 5,000 people have come out to this desert area to listen to him. And the disciples come to him and say, what we're going to do is getting late. You need to send them home because we don't have anything to feed them and they're hungry and it's getting late in the day. And he says, what have you got? And they come up with a couple of loaves and a couple of fish. And he says, set everybody down and let's feed them. And he feeds 5,000 people. Then he puts his disciples on a boat, sends them across the sea. He goes up into the mountain to pray alone. And then he walks out there, gets on the boat, goes to the other shore. And he's crossed the Sea of Galilee at this point. And all of those people, what do? They follow him over there. And then he walks out and says what to him? You followed me for the food. What does he want them to pay attention to? His teaching. That's what he's about. But you follow me for the food. So don't follow me because I made the deaf hear. Follow me because I speak for God. But he says listen, this is a man who's just been healed. And presumably close family and friends that might be with him. Okay? And the guy who heals you with the power of God says, tell no one. Here's the real question. Why did they tell anyone? Why didn't they listen to him and do what he asked them to do? And I'll submit to you that the implication is it's because they were there to be healed, not to be taught. which is a theme that we saw earlier in this book already introduced, right? Of people who were not coming to him to be taught by him, but they were simply coming to him to be healed. And they were missing the point. To borrow from another section of Scripture, when you have the two sisters, Martha and Mary, and you'll recall Jesus comes into their home and he's teaching, and one of them is busy about showing hospitality to all the guests that are in the home, and the other one is sitting at Jesus' feet. And the sister comes to him and says, "Tell her to get up and help me." And what is Jesus' response to her? Boil it down to the final line. Anybody remember what he said? She's chosen the better part. That's what we ought to be doing, is choosing the better part. What's the better part of Jesus' ministry? Healing the body or healing the soul? And yet the crowds were coming to him to be healed in their bodies. And I've suggested this as well in both this class and other sermons that I've brought recently. Listen, we spend way too much of our prayer time talking about temporal things, different problems that we have and disease and solutions that we want for our issues here. We need to spend a whole lot more time talking about our souls and our hearts and opening our eyes up to see the truth. It's a whole lot more important that I go to the grave following God than it is that I be kept from the grave. But we spend most of our time trying to protect ourselves from discomfort or death, and very little of our time trying to develop ourselves spiritually. And that's something that we need to think about as well. It's very important that we put the focus on the spiritual things. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, things that can be taken from you, but rather lay up for yourselves treasures which are in heaven. What I believe Mark is trying to do here in this section of the gospel is show us that people were just focusing on the wrong things. And that is still the case today. Still the case today. In those days, chapter 8 opens up. When again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat." And by the way, I think that line is simply explaining why they have nothing to eat. These are people who were not at home. They were following him. "And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away." His disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. Now, I'll stop here for just a moment. Let's go ahead and read verse 10. "And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmathua." So this is a separate occasion. In one case, he feeds 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 loaves. In this case, he feeds 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few fish, whatever that is. We're not told an exact number. This is a second occasion in where he does this. We also see in this a picture of the compassion that Jesus had as an individual. He said, "Look, if I send them all away to go home, they're not going to make it home." He had the means to provide for them, their needs. And so under the law, what was his obligation? He lived under the law, by the way. He kept the law perfectly. Let's just recall, well, this is pre-law, so let me think. I don't know if I can come up with a good example that I know for a fact, but we'll just go back, use Abraham as an example. I realize that this is before the law of Moses was given. But Abraham has his home there, and these three strangers show up, and what's the first thing that he does? He tells them to come in, he says he offers them something to eat, and offers them the means to clean up and refreshen themselves. Why did he do that? To show hospitality. Okay, the law of Moses codified the obligation to show hospitality. When sojourners came through the land, Jews were required to help them. When people came to them and didn't have anything, they were obligated to share what they had. By the way, the law of Christ carries that over on us as well, right? Work with your hands so that you have what you need and then have to share with others who have nothing. We have that same individual. So this is individual responsibility as a servant of God. If you have and you have an abundance, you have the means and the opportunity to help someone, you're supposed to help them. So he has the means and he has the opportunity. And this is not a situation where they can help themselves. He says, hey, they've been with me 3 days. They're away from home. If I send them home, they're not going to make it home. So sit them down. Give me the food that we have, and I'll feed them. By the way, I couldn't have fed 4,000 people on 7 loaves. Would I have been obligated before God to do that? No, I don't have the means to do it. But he did.
You think he did this he fed the 4,000 because they were impressed with his walking on the water as opposed to 5,000?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly. But I can tell you this. I think he fed them because he was obligated to show hospitality to them. I think he fed them because he had compassion upon them. I think he fed them as a sign to help them see the authority for the things that he had been teaching them for the last 3 days. Okay, they've been following him around to listen to him. Now he wants them to grasp the authority that he has and the basis on which they ought to listen to him. What did he taught them over 3 days? We don't know. How much teaching can you do over 3 days, though? I mean, think about that. And so over the course of 3 days, he had been giving discourses to these people and teaching them lessons and instructing them in various things. And this is a demonstration of the authority and power of God. So they know what? We probably ought to listen to what he said. Yes, sir. Right. Absolutely. So he does this. And by the way, if we remember the 5,000 event, you follow me not for the teaching, but for the bread. Again, the focus is not to be on the fact that he fed them bread. The focus is to be on the spiritual bread that he provides. Which, by the way, part of his teaching, I don't know if on this occasion or not, but part of his teaching that we have recorded is to teach people what? I am the bread of life. When he talked to Jews, he said, your fathers ate the bread that came from heaven. And then he said what? I am the bread from heaven. I'm the sustenance that God provides. There's the real lesson. Not in the food that they got to eat, but what the food did for their bodies, Jesus could do for their souls. There's the real lesson to be learned. The Pharisees, verse 11, came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. In another instance, it's recorded that he said, no sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah, which has reference to do with what? Anybody know? Yeah, Jonah was in the belly of a fish for 3 days and then was spat out. Jesus was to spend 3 days in the belly of the earth. And then he was going to be, so it's, the sign of Jonah has reference to his resurrection. Look, he worked more than one sign. I don't know how many signs he worked. I don't know that we have a record of all. In fact, I know we don't have a record of all the signs that he worked. The Bible tells us that. But it wasn't even about the signs. The way people acted about miracles and the way people continue to act toward miracles would seem like they're traveling across the country to get to, well, I'll just use Disneyland. They're traveling across the country to get to Disneyland, and all they really care about is seeing a sign that says Disneyland. Disneyland is this far. Disneyland is this direction. Disneyland. But they don't ever go to Disneyland. The signs are supposed to be pointing your way to something. It's not the something.
The Pharisees didn't want the information, they wanted to test.
Well, and that's a good observation. They weren't listening and learning. They were actually looking for a way to do what? To reject. That's what they were doing. That's the reason you keep asking for a sign, by the way, from someone who's just worked a sign. Okay, he's just fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread. And they walk up and go, "Well, can you give me a sign?" Now, shortly before the 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread, there was the deaf man that he gave the ability to speak, and the muteness was removed from him. And then there was, and we could go back, and it wasn't a lack of signs. It was a lack of their willingness to do what? To listen. That again is the theme that keeps presenting itself in this gospel. People were not looking for the right things or listening to what was being said. They were focusing on the wrong thing. Where's the lesson in that for us? I don't think that we are going to escape that. And we do that kind of stuff all the time. We listen attentively to what it says when it supports what we want, but when it doesn't, we conveniently forget that passage. And we ask for a sign. Obviously, well, some people ask for miracles, but I was going to say, obviously, we don't ask for a miracle, but we still ask for more proof. Can you give me more proof? Well, I mean, I understand that's what that says, but can you give me more proof? Do we need more proof? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Does God really care if I stop doing this? Can you provide me some proof? Yeah, I realize that verse says, repent so times of refreshing may come upon you, but can you show me something else that shows me that I really need to stop doing this? It doesn't say not to. There's just a whole list of things that we go through to try to justify what we want to do instead of actually listening to what we're told and accepting what we hear. Mr. Byron?
They didn't really want to learn from him. They just want to see some trick. Something that they could use against him.
Yeah, and they really didn't even want to see some trick. They really wanted him to not, so they could use it against him. And they didn't want his answers when they asked him questions. And we're painting with a broad brush here. I'm sure that there were some among them that was not true. But the ones that came to him asking him questions, very often we're told point blank that their motivation was that they were looking for something to accuse him by. If I'm looking for something to accuse someone by, I'm not listening to them to try to learn. I've already decided what I think and what I'm going to do. I'm listening merely so I can justify what I'm going to say and do. That happens all the time too. In modern times, we don't listen to our adversaries to hear what they actually say, to see if there's anything true in it. If we listen to them at all, it's so that we can pad our list of quotes that prove how bad they are. Listen, that's not listening. And so, for someone to read the Bible for purposes of finding inconsistencies and flaws that they believe may exist, they're not reading to learn and to grow and to meet God. They're not listening to God. They've already decided what they think about this. They're trying to build their ammunition to support and justify their position. Bad mistake. We need to be careful about that as well. We need to be looking for direction rather than justifying what we wish to do. All right, I got to stop. Even though the clock says it's only 7 minutes after 9, I got to stop.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea.